There are mornings that rise quietly, offering nothing more than sunlight and routine. And then there are mornings that shift the course of a life without warning or mercy. For Kachi, this was the kind of day that approached silently, carrying the weight of a future he could not yet imagine. Beneath the soft glow of dawn, something unseen stirred in the air, an invisible force preparing to test the boy who had already known too much struggle for his age. And as he walked toward the old mechanic garage, the world around him seemed to whisper that nothing about this day would remain ordinary. Kachi moved with a hesitant determination, his steps tracing the familiar path through the narrow streets of his small African town. Everything around him felt unchanged. The distant chatter of early market vendors, the restless bleating of goats, the scent of dust rising with every footfall. Yet within him, a tension pulsed like a heartbeat. He could not calm. At 15, he carried responsibilities that bent his youth into something fragile and weary. His father's sudden illness had taken away the man's strength, leaving Kachi to hold up a household too heavy for any child. And so he walked, half frightened, half hopeful, toward the mechanic garage that promised nothing except the chance to survive. The structure stood ahead like a tired beast, its rusted metal sheets groaning against the morning wind. Inside, the workshop was already awake, buzzing with noise and sweat, wrenches clashing, engines coughing, old radios murmuring beneath the grind of machinery. Men who had mastered their craft long ago worked with a rhythm that looked almost ceremonial, as if each engine were a stubborn spirit they knew how to tame. And when Kachi reached the doorway, their movement slowed just enough for them to glance at him with a mixture of confusion and amusement. They saw a thin boy, quiet and unsure, someone who looked out of place in a world that demanded strength of muscle and fearlessness of heart. Master Ophaly noticed him last. Emerging from behind a raised hood, the large man swept a discerning gaze across the boy, with the practiced detachment of someone who had long ago stopped expecting competence from new faces. Ophaly's eyes narrowed as they took in Kachi's small frame and trembling hands, and disappointment settled in his expression, even before Kachi could speak. To the seasoned mechanic, the boy looked like a burden waiting to happen, one more fragile soul who would slow down the work and waste everyone's time. But Kachi bowed respectfully, his voice soft yet steady, as he explained why he needed the job, why he could not afford to fail, why he was willing to endure anything if it meant supporting his family. Reluctantly, and with a tone that held no kindness, Ophaly allowed him to stay. The workers wasted no time in testing him, sending him back and forth across the workshop with tasks that stretched his strength thin. He lifted tools heavier than his arms could comfortably manage, cleaned oil stains that clung stubbornly to the cement, and tried desperately to follow instructions that arrived faster than he could decipher them. The noise, the pressure, the judgment, it all crashed over him like waves determined to drown the last bit of hope he held. Yet he continued, his movements shaky but earnest, driven by the quiet promise he had made to his family. Throughout the morning, he observed everything with an intensity that few noticed. While others thought he was merely frightened, he was actually studying the language of the workshop, the way engines responded to touch, the subtle shifts in tone that revealed hidden faults, the silent communication between experienced mechanics. In the midst of noise and chaos, he found patterns, rhythms, and meanings invisible to those who dismissed him. Still, the weight of judgment pressed heavily on him. Each careless remark, each impatient sigh, each lingering gaze of disapproval chipped at his confidence. But he refused to break. He forced his breath steady, lifted his chin slightly higher, and reminded himself that dignity was something no one could take unless he surrendered it. By noon, the atmosphere had grown thick, as though the workshop itself sensed what was coming. Something quietly gathered, waiting for the precise moment to fall upon him. Kachi felt it too, a strange tightening in his chest, an unexplainable sense of being watched by fate itself. Before the afternoon sun could settle fully into the sky, a single mistake, small, ordinary, and easily overlooked, would unravel everything he had tried to hold together. It would humiliate him publicly, strip him of the fragile respect he hoped to build, and brand him with a name that would follow him for years. And as the moment drew near, the air thickened with a stillness that whispered of a storm about to break, one that would alter the direction of his entire life without offering him any warning or mercy. Some moments arrive softly, disguised as harmless seconds, yet they carry the power to reshape a life forever. And in the crowded heat of that garage, as engines growled and tools clattered, fate moved quietly toward Kachi, waiting for the single slip that would expose his deepest fear. He felt nothing unusual at first, yet the air around him thickened in a way that only destiny recognizes. The afternoon sun filtered faintly through the dusty workshop windows as Kachi stepped toward the open gearbox, hoping this task would prove he could keep up with the men around him. His heart beat with a blend of determination and dread, the kind of mixture that grows inside those who are desperate to belong. He had tried all morning to hide the weight of whispered judgment, but the tension clung to him like an invisible chain. The mechanics moved with practiced unity, while he followed their rhythm one uncertain beat behind, not from lack of intelligence, but from the pressure of being watched by those waiting for him to fail. Master Ophaly stood nearby, observing everything with the stern precision of someone who believed mistakes were luxuries only the incompetent allowed themselves. The customer waiting for the repair shifted impatiently, adding another layer of urgency to the atmosphere. The workers sensed the rising tension, their silence settling into the workshop like a subtle warning. Kachi inhaled slowly and reached for the bolt, willing his trembling fingers to steady themselves long enough to complete the task without drawing unwanted attention. But fear has a way of making simple actions heavier than they should be. His grip slipped. The bolt fell. The tiny sound it made as it disappeared into the gears might have been insignificant in any other moment, yet here it landed like an accusation. A sudden stillness swept across the workshop, muting the noise of tools, engines, and conversation. Every mechanic turned. Even the customer paused mid-breath. In that suspended moment, Kachi felt the world tilt beneath him, the air growing cold as silence wrapped itself around his mistake. Master Ophaly's reaction came with the force of a storm breaking free. He stepped toward the boy with a fury sharpened by impatience and pride, his disbelief shaping the anger in his voice before the words even formed. When he shouted the insult, it tore through the garage with such volume and certainty that it felt like a judgment pronounced by the entire world. Useless. The word cut through Kachi, echoing against metal walls, spilling out through the open doorway, and traveling into the market beyond where people turned toward the sound with curiosity. The mechanics exchanged glances, some amused, some indifferent, none supportive. The customer shook his head, murmuring something that Kachi could not hear, but knew was not kind. Laughter rippled through the workshop, quiet enough to hide behind the noise of machinery, yet loud enough to burn into his memory. The air felt heavy against his skin, as if every gaze pressed deeper into the wound the insult had created. Kachi tried to steady his breath, to hold on to the fragile dignity he had carried into the workshop that morning, but humiliation spread through him like a slow, icy ache. When he finally left the garage later that afternoon, he walked in a haze of shock and shame. The world outside looked unchanged. The same marketplace stalls, the same dusty road, the same distant shouts of vendors. But everything inside him had shifted. Whispers followed him, floating from one cluster of people to the next. He did not need to hear the full sentences. The word itself was enough. It clung to him like a stain he could not wash off, settling deep in his chest, where doubt grows strongest. By the time he reached home, his steps felt heavier than any tool he had carried that day. His mother's worried gaze cut deeper than his pride allowed him to admit, and the quiet inside the house felt like an echo of the shame he had tried to swallow. He replayed the moment again and again, the slip, the silence, the shouting, and each time the humiliation felt sharper, more certain, more permanent. Yet beneath all the hurt, beneath the humiliation shaping itself into memory, something unexpected stirred. It was faint, hardly noticeable amid the noise of doubt, but it pulsed with a stubbornness that refused to fade. It whispered that one mistake could break a moment, but not a destiny, unless he allowed it to. And though he did not yet understand how, that small defiant spark would become the fire that changed everything he believed about himself. When the world turned its back on him, and every whispered insult clung to his skin like dust that refused to wash away, machines became the only voices he could bear to hear. They did not mock, they did not judge, and they did not ask him to defend his worth. In their quiet hums and broken fragments, he found a strange comfort, an invitation into a realm where he was no longer the boy labeled useless, but a mind searching for meaning. The garage emptied slowly each evening, the workers leaving one by one with heavy boots and louder conversations, eager to escape the day's heat and sweat. But Kachi lingered behind, sweeping the floors with an unhurried rhythm that disguised his true intention. He had discovered that the workshop changed after hours, turning from a battlefield of noise into a sanctuary of shadows where curiosity could breathe. Once the last voice faded, and the door shut behind Master Ophaly, Kachi allowed his broom to rest and moved toward the corner where discarded machine parts lay in a forgotten heap. This place, ignored by the mechanics and untouched by the customers, became his secret classroom. There were broken radios with tangled wires, rusty fans with stiff blades, small generators missing vital pieces, and coils that no longer held life. What seemed like junk to others felt like an invitation to Kachi. He would sit cross-legged on the concrete floor, body aching from the day's labor, yet mind awakening with an energy that felt almost sacred. His fingers traced the wires with a gentle curiosity, learning the pathways by touch before he ever understood them by knowledge. He began to notice patterns. Some parts responded to the slightest adjustment, as if grateful for the attention. Others resisted stubbornly until approached with patience and subtlety. He studied connections, memorizing how one piece relied on another, how electricity traveled like a quiet story told from one end of the machine to the other. The more he explored, the more the confusion of his earlier days melted away, replaced by a growing awareness of his own capacity to understand what others overlooked. Each night, he grew bolder. He dismantled old radios to learn how sound returned from silence, examined battery terminals until he recognized their moods, and rewound loose coils with careful precision. His hands became steadier, not from training, but from instinct, as though some hidden part of him had always known this mechanical language and was only now learning to speak it aloud. Every small success, a fan returning to motion, a cracked wire finally carrying current, filled him with a quiet triumph that the world could not steal. In these moments, he felt a reverence for the machines he touched. They did not care about the insult flung at him earlier that day, nor did they measure his worth by his size or strength. They listened in ways people did not, responding not to reputation, but to intention. Here he was not the humiliated apprentice struggling to earn respect. He was a mind discovering its power, a boy shaping his own path with grit and patience. Still, he kept this secret tightly wrapped, knowing that the revelation of his growing talent would only invite more scrutiny. The mechanics already resented his presence. They would resent him even more if they knew he was learning faster in the shadows than they could teach in daylight. So he hid his victories like treasures, locking them away behind a silence that protected him more than any defense could. Night after night, the workshop became his refuge, a place where humiliation dissolved into curiosity, and where the sting of the word useless slowly lost its power. The machines, in their quiet brokenness, mirrored something he understood well. The world might abandon what it no longer valued, but that did not mean the abandoned lacked purpose. It only meant no one had taken the time to listen. Then, on a night when the air felt unusually heavy and the moon cast long shadows across the workshop walls, Kachi noticed a familiar object leaning against the back wall. A motorcycle generator the older mechanics had declared unsalvageable months ago. It looked more complex than anything he had attempted, its wires exposed like veins and its casing dented beyond recognition. He felt a pull toward it, a strange mix of fear and fascination settling in his chest as he approached. Something deep inside him whispered that this broken machine held a test far greater than any he had faced. And as his fingers hovered above the battered generator, he felt the unmistakable stir of destiny waiting quietly for him to make his choice. There are nights when silence carries an unusual weight, as if the world itself is waiting for a choice that will change everything. For Kachi, the dim glow of the lantern cast more than shadows. It revealed the first doorway into a destiny he never knew belonged to him. In the stillness of that evening, surrounded by forgotten scraps and abandoned metal, he felt the unmistakable pull of something calling to him from the darkness. The motorcycle generator had been sitting behind the garage for months, leaning awkwardly against the wall like a wounded creature no one bothered to help. The senior mechanics had declared it beyond saving, stripping it of its worth, with the same casual certainty people used when dismissing the weak. Its wires spilled out like tangled veins, its casing dented, its interior choked with dust. To everyone else, it was just another piece of junk, one more failure not worth a second glance. But to Kachi, the machine felt different. It had a presence, a quiet plea hidden beneath its battered exterior, almost as though it recognized in him the same abandonment it had endured. He approached it slowly, not out of fear, but out of a reverence he did not yet understand. Machines had become his only companions in those lonely evenings, their brokenness reflecting back to him the parts of himself the world refused to see. He knelt beside the generator, the lantern flickering softly beside him, casting warm light over the cold metal. The stillness of the workshop wrapped around him like a cloak, removing the day's humiliation and leaving behind only the raw desire to understand. With careful fingers, Kachi began to unscrew the outer casing, each movement steady and deliberate. He treated the machine with the same patience and respect he wished he could offer his own life, measured, gentle, unafraid to look closely at the damage others ignored. When the casing finally came loose, its inner structure revealed itself in a complex tangle of wires, coils, switches, and dirt. Instead of being intimidated by the chaos, Kachi felt a quiet thrill rise within him. This was the language he had been secretly learning, the silent logic he had begun to recognize in every discarded piece he touched. Hours slipped by without his noticing. Sweat gathered on his forehead, his hands darkened with oil and dust, yet his mind remained clear. Piece by piece, he traced the generator's wiring, following each path to its end, listening to the faint whispers of what should have been happening inside. He observed the symmetry of connections, the alignment of coils, the tension in the switches. He worked with a precision that felt instinctive rather than learned, as though his mind had been waiting for this challenge to reveal what it had always known. Then, in a small corner near the ignition coil, he found it, an almost invisible fracture in a thin copper wire. It was the kind of flaw a rushed mechanic would dismiss and a tired mechanic would never notice. But Kachi saw it immediately. His heart quickened, not from arrogance, but from the overwhelming realization that his eyes, his mind, and his hands were capable of something the world had denied him. With delicate care, he repaired the broken connection, sealing it with a tension finer than threadwork. When he reassembled the generator and positioned himself to pull the starter cord, a tremor of doubt passed through him. What if it didn't work? What if this small hope was another disappointment waiting to unravel? But beneath the doubt rested a deeper determination, the quiet defiance of someone who had spent too long believing he was nothing. He inhaled, gripped the cord, and pulled. The generator coughed once, then roared to life with a powerful vibrancy that filled the silent workshop and startled his senses. The sudden flood of sound felt like a victory larger than the machine itself. It was as if the generator had been awakened by more than just skill. It had been awakened by belief. Kachi stared at the humming engine, stunned by the reality that his hands had revived something everyone else had abandoned. For the first time in his life, he did not feel small. He felt capable. He felt seen, not by people, but by purpose. The machine's steady rumble echoed inside him long after he shut it off. In its revival, he saw a reflection of what he could become if he continued to trust the quiet intelligence growing within him. And as he sat beside the lantern's fading glow, a profound certainty settled over him. His gift was real, and it had finally revealed itself. But gifts, no matter how extraordinary, are rarely welcomed by those who fear being overshadowed. And with the dawn approaching, the quiet triumph he had tasted was about to stir the kind of jealousy that could alter everything he thought he finally understood about the world. Rumors have a way of traveling faster than truth, especially in small towns where stories bloom like wildfire in the dry season. It began with whispers, quiet, cautious, almost unbelievable. But soon those same whispers carried a strange reverence, for the boy once dismissed as useless was now the one people sought in secret. As his talent whispered its way through the village, the weight of humiliation slowly loosened its grip on him. Before sunrise, while the morning dew still clung to the dusty roads, villagers began appearing at Kachi's doorstep with appliances wrapped in cloth or tucked carefully under their arms. Some carried old radios that had been silent for years. Others brought fans that no longer spun, lamps that refused to glow, or small generators that had lost their spark. They came cautiously at first, as if uncertain whether the rumors were true, but desperation outweighed doubt. And when they placed their broken items before him, they did so with the timid hope of people who had nothing left to lose. Kachi accepted each device with a quiet humility that almost hid the growing confidence inside him. He would sit outside under the soft morning light, or at the corner of his home, where the shadows stretched longest, studying every wire, every coil, every hidden flaw, as though the machines were puzzles meant only for him. His hands moved with a new kind of steadiness, a blend of instinct and experience that revealed a skill even he had not fully recognized. One by one, the machines he touched returned to life, humming softly, glowing brightly, or spinning once more with renewed purpose. Each repair added more than skill to his hands. It added dignity to his spirit. The coins villagers pressed into his palm were small, but they carried enough weight to change the sound of laughter inside his home. His siblings began eating meals that tasted fuller. His father's medicines became easier to afford, and the heaviness that had once clouded his mother's eyes began to lift. She would watch him sometimes as he worked, her gaze filled with a quiet pride that told him she finally saw something in him the world had once refused to see. As days turned into weeks, the small gatherings outside his home grew larger. People who had once joined in mocking him now waited eagerly for their turn, each whispering stories of his talent to others. Some asked how he learned so quickly, how he recognized faults others could not see, or how he restored life to machines long abandoned by trained hands. But Kachi rarely answered with more than a modest smile. He did not want praise, he wanted purpose, and with every successful repair, he felt a clearer sense of who he was becoming. Yet the world outside his home told a different story. Behind the walls of the garage, Master Ophaly watched the changes growing around Kachi with a tightening unease. He had expected the boy to disappear quietly after his humiliation, to fade into irrelevance the way so many others had before him. But instead, Kachi returned each morning with a subtle confidence that did not seek attention, yet could not be hidden. His posture straightened, his silence sharpened, and his presence carried a calm authority that unsettled those who had doubted him. Ofli began noticing small things, customers speaking warmly to Kachi, villagers glancing toward him with respect instead of ridicule, and even mechanics avoiding direct confrontation, as though uncertain how much longer the boy would remain beneath their authority. And although Kachi continued to work humbly, showing neither arrogance nor defiance, Ofli sensed something shifting in the balance of the workshop. The boy's growing confidence threatened a hierarchy built on fear, and that threat unsettled a man who had grown comfortable in his unquestioned control. But it was not confidence alone that stirred suspicion in Ofli. It was the skill itself. He could not understand how the boy repaired devices he had never been taught to handle, or how word of Kachi's growing ability reached distant corners of the village faster than any announcement he could make. There was something unsettling in the way Kachi's intelligence seemed effortless, as though the machines spoke a language only he understood. And for a man who had built his authority through expertise, watching someone rise so felt like watching his crack. But soon, the whispers continued his work with sincerity and gratitude, not realizing he was stepping into the center of a jealousy he never meant to provoke. That jealousy, quiet at first, soon sharpened into something darker, something that would not stay hidden for long. And while Kachi worked with hope in his heart, a shadow was already rising behind him, preparing to strike at the very gift he had just begun to embrace. Some forms of envy move silently, creeping like shadows in corners where trust once lived, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. And though Kachi had never sought attention or praise, the quiet brilliance of his work awakened insecurities he could neither anticipate nor control. What began as suspicion soon evolved into a bitterness powerful enough to reshape the entire atmosphere of the garage. As Kachi's confidence continued to grow, Master Ofli's unease deepened into something sharp and unsettling. He watched the boy carefully, noticing how customers greeted him with softer eyes, how villagers sometimes paused near the workshop just to ask for his help, and how even the mechanics occasionally relied on him when their own efforts faltered. For a man who had once believed every piece of the garage revolved around his authority, this shift felt like an earthquake beneath his feet. And instead of acknowledging the boy's talent, Ofli allowed fear to twist itself into accusation. One morning, without warning, he confronted Kachi with an intensity that startled even the workers. He accused the boy of repairing machines for villagers in secret, claiming that Kachi was stealing customers and undermining the business behind his back. Though the accusation had no proof, it clung to the workshop like a stain. Kachi tried to defend himself, explaining earnestly that he repaired items only at home and only after work hours. Yet his sincerity met a wall of disbelief. The tone of the garage shifted instantly, suspicion replacing patience, tension replacing cooperation, silence replacing the fragile respect he had begun to earn. From that moment, the mechanic's behavior changed in subtle yet unmistakable ways. Tools he had carefully arranged in the morning mysteriously went missing, only to reappear hours later in unlikely places. Screws he had tightened the previous day seemed loose again without explanation. Instructions became vague on purpose, and the smallest error, real or fabricated, was highlighted as evidence of incompetence. They moved around him with expressions that blended irritation and amusement, as though waiting for the moment he would finally crumble under the weight of their sabotage. Kachi felt the pressure building around him like a tightening ring. He worked twice as hard, double-checking every task and trying to anticipate the traps set in his path. Still, no amount of caution protected him from the jealousy swirling through the workshop. The space that had once felt like a battlefield of noise now felt like a labyrinth designed to confuse him, where every corner carried a risk he could not fully predict. Yet he refused to surrender to the hostility, holding on to the small hope that diligence would eventually outshine resentment. Then came the day that shattered even that hope. A customer arrived with a car needing brake adjustment, a task normally handled by the senior mechanics. But for reasons Kachi could not understand, they insisted he take the lead. He approached the vehicle with care, checking each component with methodical precision. Everything seemed in order, and he completed the repair with the confidence of someone who trusted his own eyes. But later that afternoon, the customer returned furious, claiming the brake line had nearly failed on the road. Panic filled the garage. Accusations erupted before evidence could even be considered. Mechanic after mechanic pointed fingers at Kachi, insisting he must have overlooked something vital. The accusation cut deeper than any insult. It was not merely an attack on his skill, it was an attack on his integrity. He tried to explain, tried to understand how such a mistake could have happened, but the workshop drowned his voice in blame. Master Ophelia looked at him with a disappointment that felt rehearsed, as though he had been waiting for the perfect moment to confirm his own fears. The workers exchanged satisfied glances, their envy now dressed as righteousness. Even those who sympathized remained silent, unwilling to risk their own positions for a boy standing alone. That evening, as the last traces of sunlight fell across the workshop, Kachi felt a hollow ache settle into his chest. For the first time since he had arrived at the garage, he questioned whether his place there still held meaning. The hostility had grown too raw, too intentional, too dangerous in ways he could no longer ignore. And though he tried to hold on to dignity, the weight of injustice left him standing in a space that no longer felt like a place of learning, but a place of betrayal. Yet the storm had not finished gathering. One final accusation, crueler, sharper, and impossible to defend, was waiting just ahead. And when it came, it would push Kachi out of the only place he had ever tried to belong. Sometimes life does not warn you before it tears away the last piece of stability you cling to. Sometimes the very door slammed in your face becomes the hidden passage toward a destiny you never imagined. For Kachi, the moment that should have shattered him instead cracked open the beginning of a future, waiting quietly beyond humiliation. The morning he was expelled from the garage arrived with a heaviness that settled in the air, long before the sun reached its full strength. The mechanics had gathered with a tense anticipation, their expressions carrying the weight of decisions already made behind closed doors. Master Ophelia stood at the center, anger simmering beneath the surface, fueled by jealousy, fear, and his growing need to reclaim control of a space he felt slipping away from him. Kachi knew something was wrong the moment he stepped into the workshop, but he did not expect the severity of what awaited him. Without a word of explanation, Ophelia dragged him toward the entrance, the workers following with cold detachment. The marketplace outside buzzed with its usual sounds, vendors calling out prices, women bargaining for produce, children darting between stalls. Yet everything seemed to freeze the moment the scene unfolded. In front of a crowd of startled onlookers, Ophelia accused him loudly of incompetence, sabotage, and betrayal. The word useless erupted once again, laced with finality this time, swallowed instantly by the silence that followed. The humiliation cut deeper than anything Kachi had endured, not because the insult was new, but because it came with the weight of finality, the end of the job he counted on, the end of the place he had tried so hard to grow in, the end of a fragile hope he had fought to hold together. He did not argue, did not plead, did not defend himself. The betrayal had been slow and painful, and by now, even his hurt had grown tired. He simply turned away, carrying with him the silence of someone who had lost not only a job, but a chapter of himself. When he reached home, his mother saw the truth in his eyes before he could speak. Her hands trembled as she reached for him, and the tears she tried to hide revealed how much she had hoped the garage would be their ladder out of hardship. Seeing her break under the fear of uncertainty struck Kachi harder than the humiliation itself. He felt the weight of her dreams, the fears for his future, and the fragile foundation on which their family stood. Yet as she wept, something inside him stirred, a quiet defiance rising from the ashes of the day. He realized that if the world insisted on shutting him out, he would have to carve a new path where no gatekeeper could block him. For the first time, he allowed himself to consider the possibility that his fate did not need permission from those who doubted him. His talent, once hidden beneath shadows, had grown too strong to be buried again. And even though grief clung to him, determination began to burn with a subtle intensity in his chest. The decision to leave the town was not made lightly. He packed what little he owned, a few tools, a spare shirt, the quiet courage that had kept him alive through humiliation, and set out toward a nearby village known for having a retired electrician who trained apprentices out of passion rather than profit. The journey was long and quiet, the road stretching ahead like yet every step. Then judgment, and for the first time, Kachi felt seen without being measured. He spoke honestly about his past, his mistakes, his dreams, and his desire to learn. The electrician listened carefully before offering him a place, not because of pity, but because he recognized something rare in the young boy's gaze: hunger for knowledge, humility in spirit, and a quiet brilliance waiting to be shaped. Here, in this new environment filled with patience, guidance, and opportunity, Kachi felt the beginnings of something he had not experienced in a long time: hope. The bitterness of his expulsion faded slowly, replaced by the growing understanding that sometimes the world must push you out of the wrong place before you can step into the right one. And as he stood inside that modest workshop, surrounded by tools and lessons yet to come, he had no idea that this unexpected refuge would equip him with the very skills that would one day resurrect his destiny and change everything he believed about his future. Sometimes the beginnings meant to shape destiny arrive quietly, settling in places no one pays attention to. A simple mango tree, offering nothing more than shade and stillness, can become the unlikely cradle of a dream too powerful to contain. And in that forgotten corner of the town, Kachi stepped into a version of himself no humiliation could silence. The retired electrician's lessons had opened Kachi's mind in ways he had never experienced before. The man's patient explanations, his open encouragement, and the respect with which he approached even the simplest device created a space where Kachi's confidence bloomed. Under this guidance, he learned the precision of wiring, the discipline behind circuitry, and the quiet logic that governed electricity. He absorbed every detail with a hunger sharpened by years of being underestimated. But beyond the technical skills, he found something far more valuable: a belief that his hands were capable of shaping a future he once thought unreachable. When the time finally came for him to step into the world on his own, he had almost nothing except borrowed tools, a few worn-out wires, and the quiet fire of determination burning steadily within. But he also understood that beginnings were defined, and so he walked beside him. The first customer arrived hesitantly, a farmer carrying a broken lantern whose absence had left his evenings in darkness. Kachi received the man with the kind of humility that softened even the hardest expressions. He examined the lantern with thoughtful precision, tracing the fault with gentle patience before restoring it with a simple yet effective repair. When the lantern flickered back to life, the farmer gazed at him with a mixture of gratitude and awe, pressing a few coins into his hand with a sincerity that stayed with Kachi long after the man left. Word spread faster than he expected, not loudly, but steadily, carried by those whose lives were improved by his touch. Soon villagers began arriving daily with fans that had gone silent, radios that whispered static instead of music, flashlights that refused to glow, and frayed wiring that left homes in shadows. Kachi never rushed through a repair. He approached each device with care, treating it as something worthy of attention rather than something broken beyond value. His honesty impressed people as much as his skill. If an item wasn't worth repairing, he said so with a gentleness that made customers trust him even more. Days turned into weeks, and his small stand beneath the mango tree evolved into something remarkable. He began building simple inverters for homes suffering from constant outages, crafting solar connections for families living in darkness, and helping people save money by repairing devices others had urged them to replace. His work brought light into homes that had long accepted gloom as a permanent resident. His earnings grew slowly but steadily, enough to support himself and send money home. His name traveled beyond the village, reaching the ears of strangers in nearby towns. With each success, Kachi felt a quiet triumph blossom inside him, a triumph rooted not in pride, but in gratitude. Everything he knew, everything he accomplished, had come from moments the world once used to break him. And standing under the shade of the mango tree, he understood that this humble space had become the birthplace of a dream he once believed he was unworthy of chasing. But with growing recognition came growing attention, and not all of it carried goodwill. From a distance, some watched him with curiosity. Others watched with a cautious envy, sensing something extraordinary rising where nothing was expected. Yet Kachi remained focused on the work before him, unaware of the shift approaching. One afternoon, as the wind rustled the leaves above him and the quiet hum of repaired devices filled the air, a car rolled to a stop before his stand. Its engine sputtered, coughing like a creature injured and exhausted. The driver stepped out, a stranger whose presence carried a weight different from any customer Kachi had met before. And as the stranger walked toward him with a broken car and an unreadable expression, Kachi felt a subtle tremor of fate, an intuition that this encounter was no ordinary repair, but the beginning of an opportunity powerful enough to alter everything he believed possible. Every destiny has a turning point, a moment so subtle at first that it almost slips unnoticed beneath the ordinary rhythms of a day. Yet some arrivals carry a quiet force, an energy that whispers of change long before words are spoken. And when the stranger's car sputtered to a halt beside Kachi's mango tree stand, the air itself shifted, as if fate had decided the time had finally come. The afternoon sun hung low, stretching warm shadows across the dusty road as Kachi worked patiently on a small inverter for a local family. The soft rustle of mango leaves above him blended with the hum of simple tools in his hands, creating a calm routine he had grown to treasure. He was focused, fully absorbed in the delicate alignment of wires and the silent logic guiding his fingers, when the sharp, uneven cough of a troubled engine broke the stillness. The sound did not belong to the usual village vehicles. It carried a sophistication, a mechanical complexity that stood out against the simplicity surrounding him. Kachi lifted his head, just as a sleek SUV limped to a stop a few feet away, its engine wheezing like a tired beast, refusing to take another step. The driver stepped out slowly, brushing road dust from his shirt with a distracted gesture. He was a man in his late 30s, dressed sharply despite the travel wear, his manner suggesting someone accustomed to larger cities and bigger worlds than this quiet village. Yet the frustration tightening his expression revealed something deeply human, the vulnerability that emerges when modern power fails where simplicity rules. He glanced around, clearly unsure whether any help could be. Such a modest gaze settled on. There was hesitation as if he struggled to believe, but desperation, rather than the humble apprenticeship he had known. When Kachi finally closed the hood and gestured for the man to start the engine, the SUV roared back to life with a strength that transformed skepticism into astonishment. The gratitude in the stranger's eyes was unmistakable, but behind it was something far more important: respect. He asked Kachi how he had learned to diagnose something so quickly, how he understood a machine of that complexity with such clarity, and how someone his age possessed a skill that rivaled trained engineers. Kachi answered with the same humility he carried everywhere, speaking softly about practice, observation, and the guidance he had received from the retired electrician. But the man saw more than modest words. He saw potential, unpolished, unrecognized, yet undeniably extraordinary. Their conversation deepened, shifting from casual curiosity to genuine interest as the stranger revealed his identity. A Lagos-based tech investor working in renewable systems and engineering innovations. Each answer Kachi gave seemed to surprise him further, drawing him into a realm of possibility he had not expected to discover under a rural mango tree. By the time the conversation neared its end, the investor made an offer that left Kachi breathless, an invitation to Lagos for advanced training, mentorship, and the chance to develop his talent in an environment built for brilliance. The village seemed to fade around him as he absorbed the magnitude of the opportunity. It felt almost unreal that a breakdown, a simple mechanical failure, had opened a door to a future he had never dared imagine. Yet destiny often chooses the most unlikely moments to reveal itself, and Kachi felt the quiet certainty that this was one of them. But even as excitement stirred in his chest, a heavier truth lingered beneath it. Lagos was a world far larger than anything he had known, filled with challenges no machine could warn him about. And as he prepared to step toward that unknown, he had no idea just how fiercely the city would test the limits of his courage. There are worlds designed to test the strength of a dream, cities that chew up the unprepared and spit them back into the shadows. Lagos was one of those places, loud, relentless, unforgiving. Yet Kachi stepped into it with nothing but skill, hunger, and the refusal to let his past define what he could build. Lagos confronted him on the very first day. The crowded streets pulsed with energy, engines roared like restless beasts, and towering buildings cast long shadows that made him feel smaller than ever. But he carried with him a quiet confidence stitched from struggle, a determination shaped by years of being underestimated. The investor who had discovered him guided him into a world of innovation, a startup incubator filled with young minds who spoke in numbers, systems, and visions. Kachi felt out of place at first, like a lone seed dropped into unfamiliar soil, unsure whether it would grow or disappear. But the moment he stepped into the workshop area, rows of tools arranged like instruments waiting for a conductor, everything inside him steadied. He recognized the familiar scent of metal and electricity, the hum of machines half assembled, the silent invitation to create. This environment, though more advanced and intimidating, carried the same essence as the mango tree stand and the quiet corners of the garage where he had first discovered his gift. Here, under bright lights instead of lantern glow, his talent awakened even further. He began by examining scrap materials the incubator kept for experimental projects. Old batteries, discarded metal frames, used solar sheets, wires twisted from previous prototypes, pieces most people saw as waste. But Kachi approached them with reverence, turning them in his hands as though each fragment had a story waiting to be rewritten. Weeks of experimentation followed, each day marked by failure, success, and the subtle magic of discovery. His mind worked with a precision even he didn't fully understand, piecing together concepts that blended practicality with imagination. Then came the breakthrough, a solar generator built entirely from recycled components. It harnessed sunlight with surprising efficiency, stored energy longer than expected, and cost a fraction of existing alternatives. But more importantly, it answered a need that had plagued countless rural communities: reliable, sustainable power in areas forgotten by infrastructure. When Kachi presented his prototype to the incubator panel, the room fell into a heavy, attentive silence. They expected an idea. They found a solution. They expected enthusiasm. They found innovation. And they expected the work of a beginner. They found the mind of a visionary. Investors leaned forward with interest, questioning every detail, only to be met with clear explanations delivered in the humble, confident tone that had always marked Kachi's growth. Within weeks, funding poured into the project. He received capital, mentorship, engineers to collaborate with, and access to facilities that allowed him to refine his invention with professional precision. His days became a rhythm of focus and discipline, each moment dedicated to improving the design and expanding its capabilities. As the generator gained recognition, journalists called it a marvel born from scrap. Engineers called it a rare feat of ingenuity. Communities called it hope. Production began modestly, but demand grew at a speed no one predicted. Villages that had lived in darkness lit up with the soft hum of Kachi's creation. Schools extended their hours. Small businesses revived. Families who once rationed light celebrated the return of brightness to their evenings. Every success message sent to his team felt like a quiet victory, carved from the painful stones of his past. As his company grew, expanding across states and eventually into other African countries, Kachi watched the transformation unfold with a gratitude that deepened rather than diminished. He never forgot the generator behind the garage, the humiliation that pushed him away, or the mango tree where his dream had taken its first breath. Every achievement felt tethered to the boy he had once been, the one who had refused to surrender despite the world's dismissal. In time, the business he built from scraps evolved into one of the continent's leading renewable energy enterprises. Investors called him a prodigy. Communities called him a blessing. The world called him a young billionaire. But Kachi carried the success with humility, always aware that brilliance meant little without purpose. Yet even in triumph, the past has a way of resurfacing when least expected. As Kachi prepared for another major expansion, a familiar name reappeared, one tied to the most painful chapter of his youth. And the moment he saw it, he understood that destiny was about to bring him face to face with a ghost he never thought he would confront again. There are returns that feel like echoes of old memories, gentle and familiar. And then there are returns so profound that they stop an entire town in its tracks, forcing every eye to confront what they once overlooked. When Kachi's convoy rolled toward the place he had once fled from in shame, destiny carried a heavy stillness in the air, as if the land itself sensed the weight of the moment. Years had carved themselves into the town's landscape, yet nothing felt as altered as the silence that fell the morning the new solar plant was set to be inaugurated. Kachi had spent months planning the facility, a project designed not only to bring affordable power to the villages that had been abandoned for decades, but also to honor the very soil that had shaped him. Still, he never imagined that his return would unfold like a scene suspended between past and present, between broken memories and unexpected triumph. The convoy moved slowly through the familiar streets, its polished vehicles gliding past market stalls, narrow alleys, and small houses with sun-faded walls. People gathered in clusters, whispering in awe as the realization settled in. The global CEO they had seen in newspaper features, radio announcements, and television interviews was not an outsider. He was Kachi, the quiet boy they once dismissed without second thought, the one Master Ophelia had called useless, the same boy whose tears had once mixed with the dust of this very road. As the crowd swelled, a strange blend of reverence and disbelief painted every face. Old neighbors who had watched him struggle stood frozen, eyes wide with a mixture of pride and shame. Children, too young to remember his past, were pushed forward by their parents to see greatness with their own eyes. Even the market women, usually loud and spirited, lowered their voices to hushed tones, as if fearing their excitement might shatter the fragile wonder of the moment. At the center of the crowd stood Master Ophelia. Age had softened his features in ways neither time nor regret could fully hide. His once confident posture had curved inward, as though years of guilt had pressed his shoulders toward the earth. Lines of fatigue ran across his face, but it was his eyes, clouded with remorse, that revealed the truth he carried. The man who had once ruled the garage with pride now looked like someone standing outside his own life, waiting for a moment he feared yet longed for with trembling hope. The convoy stopped, and the air tightened as Kachi stepped out. He moved with a grace shaped by years of discipline and quiet power, yet there remained a deep humility in the way he greeted the crowd. His presence commanded attention without demanding it. his steps steady and grounded in a way that spoke to every hardship he had survived. The murmurs around him fell into complete silence, as if the town itself had bowed in recognition. People who had once ignored him now strained to catch even a glimpse. Some whispered his name, letting it roll across their tongues with a reverence they had never offered before. Others looked down, unable to meet his gaze as memories of past cruelties returned uninvited. But Kachi did not move with bitterness. He carried no trace of triumph meant to belittle the past. Instead, he walked as someone who came to give rather than to take, to uplift rather than to remind others of what they had done to him. Yet the loudest silence came from the man still standing at the center of the path, Master Ophili. For a moment, he remained rooted in place, unable to take a single step forward. The weight of everything he had said, everything he had destroyed, everything he had failed to see pressed against his chest like a confession he could no longer swallow. When he finally moved, it was slow, fragile, and heavy with the burden of a truth long overdue. The crowd parted instinctively, creating a clear path between the boy he had once broken and the man he now approached. Every pair of eyes watched, breaths held, hearts suspended in uncertainty. Ophili's hands shook slightly, his voice lost somewhere in the vast distance between regret and courage. And still, he walked on. Some victories echo louder in silence than in applause, carrying a weight no amount of wealth can overshadow. There are moments when power reveals itself not in dominance, but in mercy, the kind that reshapes both the giver and the receiver. And as the crowd watched Kachi and Master Ophili face each other, it became clear that this was one of those rare moments where destiny paused to witness the healing of an old wound. For a long heartbeat, neither man spoke. The past hung thick between them, years of humiliation, untold pain, and memories that refused to soften. Master Ophili's eyes trembled with the recognition of everything he had done, every insult he had carelessly hurled, every opportunity he had denied. It was not age that bent his body forward. It was guilt. And in front of the town that had once celebrated his authority, he lowered himself to his knees, the sound of his breath unsteady as he struggled to find words worthy of atonement. His voice cracked as he apologized, the confession spilling out with a raw honesty that revealed the heaviness he had carried for years. He admitted he had misjudged the boy who once swept floors under his command, the boy he had called useless without mercy, the boy he had cast out, believing he would never rise again. Now he bowed his head before the man that boy had become, a leader reshaping the continent's future. The humility in Ophili's gesture rippled through the crowd, leaving many stunned and others quietly emotional, for they were witnessing something far beyond personal regret. They were witnessing redemption. Kachi stepped forward slowly, not out of hesitation, but out of deep reflection. The sight of the man who had once broken his spirit kneeling in the dust stirred something unexpected within him. Not triumph, not bitterness, but a profound sense of clarity. He understood now that destiny had not brought him this far, merely to prove his worth, but to show him the strength that comes from rising without hatred. His journey had taught him that resilience wasn't built on revenge. It was built on the ability to move forward without carrying the weight of those who once doubted him. He reached out gently and helped Ophili to his feet, his touch steady and respectful. The crowd watched breathlessly as he looked into the older man's weary eyes and spoke with the calm authority. He told Ophili that resilience and that the word extend a hand even to those who once pushed you away. As the sun softened into a golden dusk, painting the sky with warm strokes of light, Kachi prepared to leave the town once more. He stood in the doorway of his vehicle, taking a final look at the place that had shaped both his wounds and his strength. The cheers behind him faded into a distant hum, and all he heard was the quiet voice of purpose calling him forward. For even in triumph, he sensed that this chapter was only the beginning. A larger world awaited him, one filled with challenges that would test him far more deeply than anything he had yet conquered. If this story touched something in you, don't leave without joining our growing family of listeners who believe in resilience and destiny. Subscribe now so you never miss the powerful journeys waiting ahead, stories that remind us how far courage can carry an ordinary life. Leave your thoughts in the comments. Your voice helps keep these stories alive. And if today's tale moved your spirit, share it so someone else can find the strength hidden in their own struggle.